It's these kinds of headlines that uh, really make you pause.
Yeah, yeah,
Like 388 Indian nationals deported from the U.S. just since January.
right.
That's a lot of people, a lot of individual stories.
Absolutely. It's not just a statistic, right?
Hmm.
Each one of those is a life being uprooted.
Exactly, and in a lot of cases, maybe not even by choice.
Yeah, a lot of factors at play there.
Definitely. And it's not just the number itself, but how it happened that's really striking.
Absolutely. And in February, we saw a pretty dramatic example of that. 333 of those deportations were carried out using military flights.
Military flights. Wow.
Yeah, the C-17 Globemaster, to be precise.
Okay, so we're talking serious hardware here.
Hmm.
Usually you see those moving troops or supplies in a humanitarian crisis.
Right, exactly. So using them for civilian deportations, well, it definitely raises some questions.
It does. I mean, it makes you wonder what's driving this kind of approach.
Well, one thing it definitely signals is a sort of change in scale.
Yeah, you don't just whip out a C-17 for a handful of people, right?
Yeah. No, it suggests a concerted effort, a real prioritization of these deportations.
And it wasn't just those big group flights either.
Right. There were another 55 individuals sent back via Panama on commercial flights.
Hmm. So two separate streams almost.
Yeah, potentially indicating different circumstances or maybe different stages in the legal process for those individuals.
It makes you think about the logistics of it all.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's this whole other layer, the additional list of 295 individuals.
Right, the ones whose information is still being verified by India.
Exactly. So it's clear this is not a one-off situation. This is an ongoing process.
Definitely. And it's hard not to connect this back to the talks that happened in February between Prime Minister Modi and U.S. officials.
Right. Immigration and human trafficking were key topics on the agenda.
So is it a stretch to think that those conversations lead the groundwork for what we're seeing now?
It's certainly plausible. I mean, large-scale operations like this usually involve a certain level of diplomatic coordination.
Right, agreements about how to handle these issues, maybe even streamlining the process.
Exactly, and potentially addressing specific concerns from either side.
So let's talk about that February 5th arrival in Amritsar with the C-17.
Right, the arrival of 104 deportees.
That image really stuck with me. A plane that big, designed to transport troops and heavy equipment, now bringing people back to India in this context.
It's a powerful image, and it speaks volumes about the logistical side of things.
The sheer number of people involved the need to move them quickly and efficiently.
Right. Operational convenience was the official reason given for choosing Amritsar.
That sounds very official, very by the book.
It does, doesn't it? And in practical terms, it likely means Amritsar had the infrastructure to handle such a large, unscheduled arrival.
Right, runways big enough to accommodate a C-17.
Exactly. Maybe even dedicated facilities for processing a large group like that outside normal procedures.
So essentially, they needed a place that could handle the scale of this operation.
Precisely. And where the logistics would be as smooth as possible from their perspective.
Makes sense, but then you have the reports of how some of the deportees were treated on that flight.
Right. The allegations of shackling, including women.
That's a really disturbing detail.
It is incredibly concerning. Regardless of the reasons for deportation,
Yeah,
the use of restraints like that raises serious ethical questions.
absolutely. You have to wonder about the respect for basic human dignity in those situations.
Exactly. And that's precisely why the Indian government issued a strong protest to U.S. authorities.
Right. It's not just about the act of deportation itself, but the manner in which it's carried out.
Exactly. The means have to justify the ends, so to speak.
And we have to remember, this isn't an isolated incident either.
Right. This isn't something new.
From 2009 to 2024, over 15,000 Indian nationals were deported from the U.S.
So while the use of military aircraft is new and the scale of these recent deportations is definitely notable,
Right.
this is part of a much longer pattern, a long-standing aspect of the relationship between these two countries.
It makes you think about all the individual stories behind those numbers.
Absolutely. All the complexities of immigration laws, visa regulations, people seeking opportunities or family connections.
And how those individual journeys can end in deportation.
It's a reminder that these are not abstract issues. These are real people's lives.
And going back to that operational convenience explanation for choosing Amritsar, it all feels very impersonal, very removed from the human element.
It does, and it's worth considering what that might have meant on the ground for those arriving.
Right. What kind of reception did they face? What support systems were in place?
Exactly. Those are important questions. And it highlights the need for a more humane approach.
And then you have the possibility of India sending its own aircraft to bring back deportees in the future.
That would be a significant shift.
It feels like a way for India to take More control of the situation.
Absolutely. And to ensure the well-being of its citizens being returned.
Maybe even provide support services upon arrival.
Right, a more proactive approach showing that they're not just passive observers in this process.
Stepping back a bit, every country has the right to control its borders. Right, that's kind of
Oh, the
fundamental.
sovereignty and all that.
But where do you draw the line when it comes to how that control is enforced?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Especially when you're talking about the treatment of individuals being deported.
The methods used have to align with basic human rights and dignity.
Right, just because someone is being deported doesn't mean they lose those rights.
Exactly. And those allegations of shackling raise serious questions about whether those principles are being upheld.
So for someone listening to this, why should they care about what's happening with these deportations?
Well, for one thing, it sheds light on the human cost of these policies.
Right, these aren't just numbers. These are real people's lives being impacted.
Exactly. And it raises broader questions about human rights, immigration, international relations.
So it's about more than just these 388 individuals.
It's about the principles at stake and how we treat each other as human beings.
Let's sum it all up. What are the key takeaways here?
Okay, well, first we have a substantial increase in the number of Indian nationals being deported from the U.S.
Right, and the use of military aircraft is definitely a new development.
Underscoring the scale and the urgency of these deportations, and then you have the allegations of mistreatment.
The shackling, which is deeply concerning.
And has prompted a strong response from the Indian government. And of course, all of this is happening against a backdrop of a much longer history of deportations between the two countries.
Right. This isn't just a sudden phenomenon.
And finally, you have the possibility of India taking a more active role in the repatriation of its citizens, potentially sending its own aircraft.
So a lot to unpack, a lot to consider.
Absolutely. It's a complex situation with far-reaching implications.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a thought.
Okay.
In a world where migration is becoming more and more complex and countries are grappling with how to manage their borders, where do we draw the line ethically?
A good question.
What are the fundamental principles of human dignity and humane treatment that should never be compromised no matter what a person's immigration status is? It's easy to get caught up in the statistics, but we have to remember the human cost behind those numbers.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the individual stories within the larger narrative.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into this complex and evolving issue.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep asking those tough questions, stay engaged, and let's work together to create a more just and humane world.
Well said.
Until next time.